Simple piping. The garment making profession is an art in itself. It provides a platform to showcase one's creativity. One of the means to achieve this end is decorative seams like simple piping. One can use this simple piping in a variety of ways to increase the aesthetic value of the garment or product. And it is this simple piping that we are going to learn in this class. Objectives. At the end of this class, you will be able to describe piping in seams, identify a simple piping, sew a simple piping. What is a piping? Piping is a decorative way of outlining a seam. It is usually done on skirts, salwar kameezes, etc. There are two types of piping: simple piping, piping with cord. In this class, we will learn about simple piping. What is simple piping? Simple piping can be inserted into a plain seam to define a seam line. Let's see how to do a simple piping on a sample. Procedure of sewing simple piping. You will need the following items to do this sample: cotton fabric, another fabric for piping, straight ruler, tailor's square, straight pins, measuring tape, tailor's chalk, shears, small scissors, contrasting thread, iron, sewing machine. Now let's begin. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the sample fabric pieces. At the outset, take 2 layers of cotton fabric. Measure and draw 10 by 10 inch square on it with the help of a ruler, tailor's square, measuring tape, and a tailor's chalk. Using the shears, cut the marked squares. Step 2. Mark the seam allowance. Now, take one of the fabric pieces and lay it on the table with its wrong side up. Using a tailor's square, measuring tape, and tailor's chalk, mark 1 inch seam allowance along one of its cut edges. Step 3. Prepare another fabric strip for piping. Cut a 10-inch long and 2.5-inch wide strip of another fabric in 45-degree angle to the fabric grain. Fold this strip in half and press it with iron. Step 4. Place in position the fabric strip for piping. Now take the two pieces with the right side together and in between insert the folded strip along the seam facing outside. Pin all 4 layers together with the marked seam line on the upper side. Step 5. Stitch the seam line. Now we will start stitching. Press the reverse stitch lever and start with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Leave the reverse stitch lever and stitch along the seam line with a normal stitch length. Again, press the reverse stitch lever and end with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Snip the thread with a pair of small scissors and remove the straight pins. Step 6. Press the seam line. Press the seam line with an iron. Then open the fabric and the seam allowance so that the right sides of the fabric are no longer together. Then press the seam open with an iron. The 1/4 inch folded piping can face to one side. Finally, you have your sample with the simple piping in seam ready. Please note, here we are using a contrasting thread for demonstration purposes only so that it is visible, but otherwise one would use a thread matching to the fabric. With that, we come to the end of this class. Let's recall what we have learned in this class. Simple piping can be inserted into a plain seam to define a seam line. The procedure of sewing the simple piping, let's review its basic steps. Step 1. Measure, mark and cut out the sample fabric pieces. Step 2. Mark seam allowance. Step 3. Prepare another fabric strip for piping. Step 4. Place in position the fabric strip for piping. Step 5. Stitch the seam line. Step 6. Press the seam line. This is simple piping. So now you have learned all about simple piping. Take our next class to learn about piping with cord.